You can't talk about gay characters in gaming without acknowledging the elephant in the room that is Dorian Pavus from Dragon Age Inquisition. For a few years that would have gone unquestioned, but it's now been well over a decade since Inquisition launched, and I don't think I can just say that without explanation anymore and expect people to follow. And since it's been so long, I think those who remember Dorian's impact might still need a refresher. So who is Dorian? Dragon Age Inquisition, the third entry in BioWare's Dragon Age series, released in late 2014 to wide critical acclaim, going on to win the very first Game of the Year award that year. In it, you play as a player-customized Inquisitor, sole survivor of an explosion that tore a giant breach and multiple smaller rifts between the world of Thedas, the main setting, and the Fade, a dimension full of demons, spirits, and such. In surviving the explosion, the Inquisitor gains the power to fix the rifts, and with some new allies forms the Inquisition, an organisation to defend the world against otherworldly dangers and fix a lot of rifts in the process. There's a lot more to it than that, of course, it's Dragon Age, but if you want more details there are much better summaries than the ones I just gave that go into more detail. What is important is that on the Inquisitor's adventure they meet Dorian. How exactly you meet Dorian depends on an in-game choice, but the choice that gives him a bit more narrative relevance will have the Inquisitor meeting him during a quest to align with the mages, where he has to aid the Inquisitor in defeating his former, now corrupted mentor, who is aiding the villainous Venatori. Depending on your choices during this quest, you can invite him to join the Inquisition and become a party member. He's a mage specialising in necromancy hailing from the nation of Tevinter, a mageocracy being a government that prioritises the nation's mages above anything else, with a deeply entrenched class system and open practice of slavery. Having defected from his homeland, Dorian is vocal about their issues, yet occasionally defensive of their culture, especially given that he was raised as nobility, but this also makes him all the more aware of the suffocating societal expectations placed on him. Dorian is witty, charming, and has a wry sense of humour, but he's not without his flaws.
He's snobby, condescending, sarcastic, vain and childish. He's an emotionally stumped alcoholic who loves provoking fights for the sake of drama. He's an intellectually gifted and magically talented elitist who also happens to be incredibly handsome, and he shamelessly flaunts all three to anyone who happens to be nearby.
While Dorian can be present and a party member for many of the main quests and will have plenty to say in ambient commentary, he's unfortunately not that important to the main narrative of Inquisition. He really gets to shine however during side content, particularly his romance. After Dorian joins a party you can go and flirt with him whenever you're so inclined, and eventually Dorian will start to return the affection. Once Dorian and the Inquisitor are close enough, you'll be informed of a letter that arrived at the Inquisition base from Dorian's estranged father, asking for him to meet a family retainer in a neutral location. You're told not to tell Dorian about the letter and just try and get him to go, but for best romancing results, it's best to tell him anyway so as to not break his trust. Upon reaching the meeting spot and acting as moral support for Dorian, you'll discover no such retainer and it's actually Dorian's father himself. This of course angers the mage, who'll reveal to the Inquisitor his reason for running from his family is because of his homosexuality and that he was unwilling to take part in an arranged marriage and father a child with his betrothed.
Powerful houses fight for dominance and vie for the perfection of their bloodlines through careful matchmaking strategies, following politics and practices that are reminiscent of eugenics. Being openly gay and refusing to perpetuate his bloodline with a female companion chosen for him, Dorian's backstory involves him running counter his father's plans, since every perceived flaw, every aberration is deviant and shameful in Tevinter.
In his desperation for his son to follow Tevinter tradition and continue their legacy, Dorian's father planned for a blood magic ritual to be done on Dorian without his consent in an attempt to change his sexuality, an experimental procedure that could have easily ended in total mental failure if botched. But Dorian's father is here to beg forgiveness and try and reconcile with his understandably upset son. Depending on your choices, you can encourage Dorian to patch things up with his father or leave without accepting the apology. Upon returning to the base, no matter which choice he made, you can choose to console and support Dorian, let him talk through his feelings with the Inquisitor, and then kiss him to officially romance him. While this is a meat of the relationship, you'll get more scenes with him throughout the game, giving more depth to his romance with the Inquisitor, including the choice for them to become official. Dorian ends the Inquisition, returning to Tevinter to rebuild and hopefully reshape his home nation, and if romanced, he'll gift the Inquisitor a sending crystal so they can stay in contact long distance. In spite of being far from the centre of the drama for most of the main narrative of Inquisition, Dorian forges his path into the spotlight by stealing pretty much any scene he gets a chance to open his mouth in, and he does all of this while being openly, and I mean this is no insult, very gay, and like it or not, that became a large part of his legacy. Not only is Dorian a romance option for a male Inquisitor, he's only an option for a male Inquisitor. While there are now quite a lot of options for gay romances in games, very few of them are exclusively gay. In games with multiple romance options, there are still plenty of characters who will be exclusively in straight romances, and those that are given the option to be in a same-sex romance will still usually be an option for straight romances as well. But it is very rare to have a character who will exclusively go for the same gender even now. And before you bring up population percentages and how a small minority don't need this much representation, representation, believe me when I say it's still underrepresented. This doesn't inherently make Dorian a better gay character in gaming, but it does make him a rarer one. Being gay isn't just a trivia point for Dorian either. As you saw, it's a major focal point for his narrative and backstory. His core emotional arc, while not being about accepting his sexuality, he's clearly got that part out of the way, is about accepting how his sexuality has drastically altered his relationship with his family and his homeland, and how it's made him a more emotionally guarded person.
Dorian is 30 years old. Whatever defensive coping mechanisms he has developed over the years have become so intertwined with his personality that they are now fully part of who he is.
Head writer for Dorian in Inquisition, David Gader, made a whole post dedicated to explaining the importance of Dorian's sexuality to his storyline.
Of course, a character being gay is not a substitute for them having goals or character development, but in this case, Dorian's role in the game was more or less already established. Homophobia didn't exist in Thedas per se, but Tevinter society has a very rigid set of requirements regarding what was accepted behaviour for their elite citizens. You have to look the part, and more than that, you had to devote yourself to a good marriage and to your family's cause. Anything less than that and you were a pariah, too weak to even maintain the expected facade. If you couldn't manage that, after all, then how competent could you truly be? Dorian is someone who rejected that life, despite all the benefits it could offer and despite his parents' worries and best intentions, because living truthfully meant more to him.
Dorian's character arc was specifically written with his sexuality in mind, and he would not be the same character if that wasn't the case, and that is where a lot of the complaints about Dorian come from. Why does a gay character have to have their storyline defined by being gay?
Okay, fine, you win with your gay stuff.
While Dorian is a popular character, he isn't without his share of detractors, and there seems to be one criticism that most arguments against him share.
Some read him as a gay stereotype and stated that his storyline focuses too much on his sexuality. My real issue with Dorian is that he's mostly there for the sake of there being a gay guy. Forced as fuck. Ham-fisted and cliched. A poor attempt at a good gay storyline. I'm disappointed in BioWare for his personal arc. Most writers seem to have yet to realise that gay characters can have personal issues that are unrelated to their gayness.
Like I said, Dorian's narrative is steeped in his sexuality, and while he would still have a personality without it, his storyline would look completely different if his sexuality wasn't a factor. But even then, his personality was also an issue, since it's also defined by his sexuality.
We are not all flamboyant, sex-crazed, walking stereotypes IRL. So why are we being represented this way? Yet another BioWare trademarked daddy issue character. I'm almost surprised he doesn't come pre-packaged with a limp wrist, a handbag and some lip gloss and an iPod filled with Cher's greatest hits, since they're clearly trying to go for the offensive stereotype with him. He's practically Freddie Mercury's more magically inclined twin. I find him annoying and arrogant, to be honest.
And it's not just his personality either, but how he looks too.
The moustache is a perfect illustration of Dorian's reading as a stereotype, as it is also reminiscent of those found in the artwork of Tom of Finland. Famous for his homoerotic drawings, Dorian's muscles and moustache are very similar to Finland's policemen, sailors and leather men. If they didn't want to add a gay character, why didn't they just leave it at that instead of producing this grotesque parody of what people thought a homosexual looked like back in the 1950s?
But not only was Dorian's storyline centered around being gay, not only was his personality and appearance heavily inspired by common gay iconography, but BioWare couldn't help themselves and openly marketed Dorian as a gay character as well. Months before release, Dorian's sexuality reached headlines before his actual name. Dragon Age Inquisition writer talks series' first gay character.
I hate the way they try and promote him and say, hey, look at our gay character. I feel like they lessen him and make him just a token minority. I take issue with characters being advertised as gay. If a character's most prominent trait is their sexual orientation, that is a sign of poor writing.
While some of these complaints touch on more valid points than others, and I don't want to just dismiss them all with a sweeping statement, a common theme that underlies all of them is a prominence of Dorian's sexuality. There's a desire for gay characters to just happen to be gay, and a suggestion that the more a character addresses and brings attention to their sexuality, the more it detracts from the quality of their writing. There isn't an issue with Dorian being gay, and perish the thought that they're implying anything homophobic, but why is Dorian always going on about being gay?
What BioWare should have done, and what most video game producers should do, is make their character's sexuality and gender identity a secret. Don't completely hide it away, but drop hints and clues in their character's dialogue. Make finding out their sexuality trivia and something that the player has to find out on their own, and not just get told about.
It's tempting to respond to my bespoke collection of Dorian criticisms with something along the lines of, Dorian, not just Dorian but gay characters in general, should be allowed to be vocally gay. Fuck off. But that would be reductive. So instead I want to address how Dorian is a great example of how a character's narrative can be enhanced, not limited, by having such a strong focus on sexuality. Fantasy discrimination is a powerful narrative device when used effectively, but I think we're all aware of how heavy-handed and immersion-breaking it can be when used clumsily. One of the most egregious recent examples is actually Final Fantasy XVI, with the introduction of bearers, people who are naturally gifted at magic, but thanks to the laws of the world, immediately enslaved and branded, forced to use their magic until their body gives out and they turn to stone. It's an interesting premise, and there are plenty of memorable side quests that have you interacting with bearers. Clive even spends a lot of the game acting as a bearer, but they're unfortunately never given much narrative weight and feel like an underdeveloped and badly thought out attempt to make the world feel grittier. A much more successful example is Metaphor ReFantasio, a game with a whole host of different races called tribes, all of which have an interesting place in the world and the narrative. While reflecting clearly on real-world racism, it's never too on the nose to feel like a parody, instead adding depth to the setting, making the world more interesting to explore and learn about. It's a risk since it's a big swing, and if you miss, it can be cringe-inducing, but if you succeed, it will make your game all the more memorable for the right reasons. So where does Dorian fit into this? Dorian's story is a weird hybrid approach to fantasy discrimination, since being gay isn't a fantasy concept, at least I don't think it is, but being gay has a unique impact on Dorian's life because he's in a fantasy setting. While Tevinter is an important nation within Inquisition, we never actually visit it in person during the story, so having Dorian as a sole party member from this nation gives a unique and valuable insight into Tevinter culture. We know that Tevinter is an elitist nation where magical capability is put above all, and Dorian's narrative exemplifies that. Relationships between nobles aren't based on romance, but instead breeding capability, to hone magical ability with each generation in hopes that your house can gain influence by having the most magically powerful children possible. It's fantasy eugenics, and its existence and description by Dorian paints a vivid picture of what his life in Tevinter was like. Its importance is reinforced when you learn that Dorian's father was willing to go to such lengths to force his son to change for a dangerous experimental blood magic procedure, not because he has a particular moral or religious issue with Dorian being gay, but Dorian's insistence on being publicly gay, refusing to enter a fake marriage and have children, is a direct defiance of his culture and breeding. Dorian was born with the eventual purpose to sire children unquestioningly.
It is not Dorian's desire for other men that upsets his father, but his inability, and more importantly, his refusal to produce an heir. There is therefore a nuance here between the idea that Dorian's father potentially tolerates his son's sexuality but does not accept its consequences.
It's an obvious parallel to conversion therapy, parents putting their children in harm's way to potentially change their sexuality. It's hardly well hidden, but the way it's twisted to be justified in this setting doesn't just make Dorian a more engaging character, it also serves to flesh out the world as it exists around him. It makes Tevinter a more palpable setting without ever actually going there, and it characterizes why Dorian has such a rebellious streak, but also such foundational trust issues, and also why near the end of the story, he's dead set on returning to Tevinter to hopefully change it for the better. And so it shifts back to why Dorian's narrative revolves so heavily around his sexuality. He represents how your sexuality will change how you interact with the world. There are characters in the wider gaming sphere who have their sexuality as more of a background focus, and even in Inquisition itself with characters like Iron Bull and Josephine, and that's fine and to be expected. However, it's unrealistic to overlook that some characters who are gay might have been affected by their sexuality in more notable ways, and they might have the audacity to mention it like Dorian. As seen here, it doesn't break immersion but only makes the world feel more real. I fear the "we're just like you, we're completely normal, we could be anyone" narrative has gone so far that acknowledging that you're gay and that it might change how you interact with the world is treated like it's obnoxious. There is value in those narratives, especially for gay youth who feel a need to fit in, but an unintended side effect that sometimes comes across is that if you're a noticeably gay person, that's a kind of moral failing. While I completely understand the normalization aspect of it, it doesn't do anyone any good to act like we're all at equal standing. Saying it shouldn't matter is a lovely sentiment, I appreciate the passive activism, but it's used so often as a very weak way of dressing up "I don't care," and if you want to say that, then say it with your chest. It's a point Dorian's defenders don't hesitate to verbalize.
To say that the game shouldn't care they're gay is a little ridiculous, when in real life people really do care if you are gay or not, and obviously that affects your life. Sexuality is a huge part of a person's life experience, doubly so if they find themselves outside established cultural norms. No reason why it shouldn't be more than a passing reference. I don't find it any more progressive to ignore every queer character's sexuality than it's progressive to make every queer character revolve around their sexuality. There's been 10 queer love interests in Dragon Age so far. 9 of those make it a complete non-issue. I think it's great to have a character whose sexuality is important, especially when it fits within the context of the narrative and when it's not the sole defining characteristic. Because sexuality is important. It's important to me and it's important to Dorian. It's part of what made me who I am and part of what made Dorian who he is. Demanding that every queer character approach it identically and nonchalantly is reductive, especially when that's already in place as the rule rather than the exception.
And the ironic thing is, Dorian does address this nonchalantly. Even though he has every right to, Dorian doesn't woe is me his way through the game. You'll only learn about Dorian's conversion therapy if you actively seek it out in Dorian's companion quest, and even when he talks about it there, he's reserved about his struggles and tries to brush it off, and will unless you really pry. But aside from that, Dorian just fucking loves being gay. He'll shamelessly flirt with a male Inquisitor, calling him handsome or strapping if you give him an inch, and if you don't romance him and leave Ironball free, he'll start flirting with him instead. Try as you might, Dorian will pry his way out of any closet. The pairing of Dorian and Ironball is arguably just as popular as Dorian and the Inquisitor, especially since they're both actual characters and neither is character created. Throughout this section, I've quoted Pellison's dissertation on Dorian a few times. They unintentionally or not ended up archiving a lot of now deleted forum posts that would have otherwise been inaccessible. In their essay, they've got a whole dedicated section exploring Dorian and Ironball there, so I'd recommend reading it if you want to know more about the pairing. I wouldn't really know since I'm incapable of playing Inquisition without romancing Dorian. Pellison's essay also quantifies a point I want to clarify, that Dorian is a widely appreciated character. While I was able to find plenty of complaints about him, I mean of course I was, he's a gay character in a mainstream game, these are very much in the minority.
Out of 162 comments debating whether Dorian was a stereotypical character, only 9 considered Dorian to be a negative stereotype, and 21 expressed mixed views.
I'm not going to try and pretend that my point of view is in the minority to make it more juicy. Dorian's a great character and most people know that, but of course you can't please everyone. When discussing Dorian like this, it's easy to say that he's defined by his sexuality, and while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it's just not even wholly true for him. Aside from his shameless flirting, his personality shines in ambient dialogue. He'll nearly always have a unique perspective on plot developments, and his complex relationship with Tevinter isn't just defined by his personal trauma. Tevinter's class structure is rigid, and it's one of the few nations in Phaedas that still openly practices slavery, and while Dorian could easily gloss over this being born into high society, he doesn't. But he's also aware of how challenging it would be to reform a whole country. It's why he gets so defensive around other characters who make generalizations about Tevinter, since while he knows they're making valid points, he wants them to know that not everyone from Tevinter is complicit or approving in the way their society is built. You'll often hear that a good gay character is one that just happens to be gay, but if that was the case, we wouldn't have a character like Dorian. But Dorian's a good character. It's a catch-22. Sure, being gay is something that just happens. It occurs naturally, apparently, but it will impact your life whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Being in the closet for however long tends to arrest or sometimes accelerate development, and even in the most accepting countries, there will still be a notable percentage of the population who don't accept your existence. And I'm not even going to get into the history of laws surrounding sexuality because it's just depressing. This isn't begging for pity, it's just pointing out the reality, because depending on the environment you're in, it's sometimes easy to forget. I bring it up because it's a human experience, and human experiences influence the best characters, and that's how we ended up with Dorian. You don't need me to tell you that you're allowed to dislike Dorian, but there's a stark difference between not liking him because of his stupid mustache or the fact that his nipple's almost always peeking out, and not liking him because he talks about being gay. That being said, Dorian is an undeniably good guy. He's fighting for what's right and the story is very much on his side. It makes him an easy gay character to like since it feels like the right thing to do. But what if Dorian was a bit more of an asshole?
1, 2, 3.
Thank you for making it to the end. Well, not really the end. If you were watching this and thought it sounded like there might have been some wider point I was alluding to, that's because there is. This is part of a much longer video about gay men and gaming, so if you like this, hopefully you'll like that. There's also other shorter videos showcasing other sections from the full thing, but if you want it all together, then I'd recommend the complete version. Either way, subscribing would be fantastic if you want more, and I hope I'll see you in my next fully new video, likely sometime in August or September, but no promises.